Alright, welcome back to a new lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a very interesting method called the visual timeline. It is a neurolinguistic programming method that demands quite a bit of imagination and creativity, and it is absolutely phenomenal. It can be even used as a form of a meditation exercise to reflect on your future and your past. Now, this method can help you in two particular things. First, it can help you if you have a goal in the future and you don't really know how to achieve it. There's a goal or a milestone you want to reach, but you don't know how to get there. And obviously, there are some steps you need to take to get to where you're trying to get. And this visual timeline method will help you with that. Another thing it can help you with is when it comes to past experiences. There's a lot of past experiences that have a certain influence on you. You felt a certain way when it came to a certain experience in the past, and you developed a belief that lives in the body and that you carry with you in the present moment, and that is going to affect your future if you don't change. So, looking at the visual timeline, it looks something like that. If you were standing, let's say right now you're in front of a computer or you're holding your phone. If you were to imagine yourself getting out of your body and floating on top of you, looking at you from the third party's perspective, and you see two arrows, one that's going in front of you and the other one that's going behind you. Now, usually, we associate an arrow moving forward with our future and an arrow moving backwards with our past. And we're going to use that representation when we want to talk about the visual timeline system. You need to understand this concept because if you don't, you won't be able to apply the visual timeline system properly. So it's easy. It's very simple. Wherever you are right now, if you look ahead of you, imagine an arrow getting drawn in front of you, and that represents your future, and an arrow behind you that represents your past. It's kind of common sense. In front of you is the future, behind you is the past. Now let's look into using the visual timeline. And in this example, we want to use the visual timeline to solve a future problem. So now that you understand how the timeline actually works, when we talk about a future problem, we're talking about an arrow getting drawn in front of us. And as you saw in the graphic beforehand, it can be a big line that's forming on top of you, moving towards you and behind you, with two arrows pointing one towards the front and one towards the back, representing the future and the past correspondingly. Step number one, and even before step number one, you do want to identify what future problem you're trying to solve, or what goal or milestone you're trying to reach. And step number one is that you will close your eyes and see yourself from a third party's perspective. So imagine wherever you are now, if you close your eyes, that this other version of you gets out of your body and it starts floating on top of you. And as it floats on top of you, you can see the two big arrows. And we want to focus, as we said, on the future arrow, the one in front of you, right? The focus, which is step number two, is the future. So try to identify a milestone or future goal you want to achieve and when you'd want to achieve it. So as this version of you that's floating on top of you, looking at the timeline, you can see the timeline. Maybe you can even see the months that's written on the timeline. And then you can look far and you can see your milestone, the goal that you're trying to achieve. You can see it, but you're still far from it, right? You're still floating on top of you. Now, step number three, from the third person's perspective, imagine yourself floating on top of the timeline, far enough that you can see where you are and the goal you want to achieve on the timeline. Now, you want to start moving forward towards the goal or towards the timeline. And as you do, you are observing whatever is happening around you, especially what's happening on the timeline. as you're moving towards your goal, you can see the steps that you're taking, what you're doing, what you're achieving, the small goals that you're doing, and that the small successes that you are encountering in order for you to reach the goal, the big goal, or the big milestone. Now, step number 4 is observe a mental scenario of all the steps you need to take from where you are to where you want to be. As you're floating, you are looking at yourself moving in that future timeline and achieving the little things that we talked about until you reach the final step, until you reach the milestone or the big goal. This is exactly where you get creative. Now, you're floating on top and you see everything, and everything's under your control. And you know where you're going. You know where your goal is. And I'm going to give an example about that. Now, as you're floating, you see yourself achieving those smaller goals until you get to that bigger goal. And once you get to that bigger goal, you know that now you got there. You achieved it, right? And you already went through the steps that you needed to take. And what you need to do when you're done the exercise is write down those steps that you were imagining and visualizing. Because once you write them down after the visual timeline system session, you will be able to then break them down and work on them. Now, there is a little problem that some people might encounter, and a lot of my clients encountered that problem, is that there are some steps that they can't really visualize. There are some steps that they are unaware of. Well, this is the part where you don't need to get frustrated. If there's a step that's missing, it's okay. What's important is for you to first figure out the steps that you know you need to take to get to your goal. And now that you know there are some missing steps, you know exactly where the missing steps are. So let's say you're taking 15 steps to reach the milestone, and you figured out the steps 1 to 15, but there's number 7 and number 9 and number 11 that you still didn't figure out. Well, the thing is, step number 7 is right in between step number 6 and step number 8. Now, if you use the creative deassociation and association formula that we talked about in another lecture, you probably went through it, or maybe you didn't go through it yet, but if you do, when you get to the lecture, you'll know what I'm talking about. The creative dissociation association formula that you can use to figure out that missing step or those missing steps. Now, I want to talk about some ideas to keep in mind before we move to a practical example and explain the future visual timeline a bit better. First off, it is important to remember the TFAR system. And if you didn't go through it yet, you will go through it in a further lecture. Basically, the system, if I want to summarize it for now, T equals F equals A equals R. Thoughts equals feelings equals actions equals results. So the thoughts and emotions or feelings, they lead to actions, and the actions lead to results. When using the visual timeline method, you might want to take a second while floating above the milestone. So we said that you're gonna move all the way. You're gonna float until you get on top of the milestone or the big goal that you want to achieve. And one thing that I found to be very effective when my clients tried it is to float down into it and experience it. So as you float above the milestone, you want to float down into the milestone or the goal, to the moment where you achieved what you want to achieve, and then look around you. See how you feel, what emotions you are experiencing, and what thoughts are running through your head, what kind of life you're living, and then bring back that mental state into the present moment when you finish the exercise. So what's really happening here? Well, usually, people think that the big problem is action, that they're not taking the right action. But the thing is, action comes from the combination of our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. When you think a certain thought and you feel a certain way, you act a certain way. So what you're doing is you're moving all the way to the point where you achieve the goal, and then you see how you feel. All the emotions and thoughts going through your head. Maybe that you're unstoppable, that you're so happy, that you're on top of the world, that you are a sales expert, whatever the goal is. And then bring back that state into the present moment, because if you want to get to your goal, you need to take the right actions. And for you to take the right actions, you need to have the right thought process and the right feelings and emotions, this combination of this chemistry of emotions and feelings that you need, combining them with a thought process to get the actions that you need to take to get to where you're trying to get. Now, another thing to keep in mind is make sure that when you use it and you intend on working right after, that your work environment is positioned in front of you. What do I mean by that? Well, the visual timeline, as we said, your future is ahead of you. Now, if you want to work on whatever you're trying to visualize right after the exercise, it's important that your work environment is in front of you. Because if you stop and then you get up and you turn around and go to work, then what's happening is you are confusing your subconscious brain, because behind you is the past and you want to work on something in the future, which should be something in front of you. It's how our submodalities in the subconscious brain get formed and confused if you don't do so. And lastly, you can use the visual timeline to fixate your focus on several milestones. You can use it for different areas in your life as well. The goal here is to get creative with it. The more creative you get, the more creative your results will be. So you can use the visual timeline if you're trying to build a business. Let's say your goal is to build a 6-figure business, and we're going to talk about this in a second. You can use that. Let's say another goal is for you to reach a certain physical shape. This is also a place where you can use the visual timeline method. Let's say you have a goal of pursuing higher education. You can use the visual timeline method. Whatever it is, your goal or the milestone you're trying to reach, you can get creative with it and implement it in the visual timeline system, and you can find the steps that you need to take to get to where you're trying to get. So now that you understand all of those ideas, let's take an example, a practical example, to help you understand the process a bit better. So as you can see in this example right here, there's the avatar, that's you, and there is the arrow pointing forward, which represents the future. And there is an escalation, a ladder of goals. And then at the end, there's one single goal that's kind of below the arrow. Now, this is just a representation. Every single goal needs to be exactly where the dot is. This is where the image is going to be formed. But the reason I put it below is to make you understand that this is the milestone. This is the big goal that you're trying to get to, right? So you visualize a timeline. And then you see yourself floating. And the first step that you take is that you see yourself creating a business plan and getting very excited and building an awesome business plan. And then the next step is applying this business plan and adjusting it according to what you need and then making it work. And then the third step, you see yourself building a marketing campaign and designing some banners and designing some ads and launching the marketing campaigns and seeing awesome results. You keep doing that until you get to the fourth step and you see yourself getting your first client and being so happy about getting your first client that you made it, you got your first clients. And now the fifth or sixth step is to get 50 recurrent clients. So you see yourself in the process signing up one client after another, until you get to 50 clients. And then once you get that, you reached the milestone or the goal, which is now you're at a point where you made 6 figures. And now what do? Well, as I said, something extra that you can do to make the exercise even more efficient is to float down into this mental image or little mental movie that you formed that you link to the goal or the milestone of you making 6 figures. And you look around you, you see how you feel, what you think, what your thought process is, and how you're living. And then when you're done, and then you figured out the steps, and if there's a step missing, as I said, go back to the creative dissociation and association formula, and then write down those steps. But before you do, you want to float back up and embody the emotions and the thought process and the feelings that you had when you were floating down into this milestone. And then move back as you see yourself moving backwards all the way to the present moment. Embody yourself again and open your eyes and write down the steps. This is how you can use the visual timeline for a future process. And as I said, it is a method that was used by a lot of my clients and a lot of people I know. And it's absolutely life-changing when you do it properly. So now let's move on to how you can use the visual timeline to fix something related to your past. So in the example where we want to use the visual timeline to solve a past problem, you got to keep in mind that it is a bit more challenging than using the timeline for past experience than using it for future experience, as there are some installed experiences in your subconscious brain. However, you can use a timeline to change how an experience made you feel. And this is important. We'll go back to the TFAR system we talked about. Thoughts equals feelings equals actions equals results. So it doesn't really matter if you change the memory itself, as long as you change how it made you feel, because it's how you feel and what you think that makes you take certain actions. And when you change how you feel and what you think about, you will change your actions accordingly. And this is what we really want to focus on. So the first step is, well, obviously, before the first step, you want to identify this past experience that made you feel a certain way, and that is affecting you today, and that will affect you in the future. And the first step is to close your eyes and see yourself from third party's eyes, a third party's perspective, standing with two arrows unfolding in front of you and behind you. And the main focus here is the past. So try to identify a past experience that you know has affected you in some way. Step number 3 is, from this third person's perspective, imagine yourself floating on top of the timeline, but backwards, because we're moving towards the past, remember. And you want to float up far enough that you can see yourself from the third party's perspective, and as well as you can see your past timeline all the way to the point where there is this past experience that you want to change. Now, step number 4, as you do, you want to start floating bit by bit, remember, backwards. You want to float on top of this backwards or past timeline bit by bit towards the past experience. And as you go step by step through the past experiences until you get there, you want to make sure that you are aware of what's happening. So as you're floating back, you are looking at, more recent past experiences happening. You can see this mental image or mental movie that's forming, moving backwards, and backwards until you reach this past experience that you want to change. Now, step number 5 is, once you get on top of the experience, you want to look at it from an upper and superior position. You are floating on top of it in a way that you are in control. And now that you're not the same person, that you are a higher version of yourself, looking at things from a different perspective, you're wiser and more knowledgeable. And ask yourself, how do you feel in this memory? Identify that. And then ask yourself, how do you want to feel instead? Now imagine yourself feeling what you want to feel in that memory. So whatever emotions that you want to replace, what are the emotions that you want to replace them with? Embody those emotions, feel them, and then fixate them in the memory. Include them in the memory. Change the way that you were feeling in that memory, and you do have that control. You can use your imagination to do that, to change how you felt in that memory and to wash away all the negative and install the positive. Now, as you're done and you installed the new emotion and you washed away the negative emotions you were feeling, you want to float back through the timeline till you reach the present moment, while still from the third party's point of view. You want to be floating above yourself and notice how you feel, the change that you made in your belief and in your emotions and in your feelings. Step number 7 is embody the change. You did a certain alteration, a past adjustment, and this has an effect on you in the present moment. Embody it and see how it changed your belief. You want to feel empowered. Feel that the problem is now solved and that you are at ease. Step number 8, you can take it a step further. And now you want to start floating into your future and see how this alteration that you did in the past, this change in belief that you did to one past experience is changing your future to the better. And what you want to do in step number 9 is to identify the biggest goal that you'll be able to achieve now that you healed the past experience. And keep floating above all the steps until you reach this goal. Once you get there, feel the empowerment again, embody it, the power of yourself and your spirit, and float down into this goal that you're now able to achieve because you changed how you felt and what emotions and thoughts you had in that past experience. This goal that now you're able to achieve, float down and observe it. Observe the goal. Observe how you feel. Feel yourself being so empowered now that by changing one thing in your past, you changed your entire future. And finally, step number 10, you want to float back up and float back to the present moment, bringing back with you all the emotions of empowerment, strength, and calmness that you acquired. Once you do that, you will have effectively used the visual timeline method to change how a past experience made you feel. I really hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I highly encourage you to try the exercise. For fun, or if you want to use it effectively to solve problems, or even as just a meditation process that can make you a bit more mindful of what's happening in the present, in the past, in the future, and how you can get from point A to point B. And I'll see you all in the next lecture.